everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History of I podcast. And today I'm joined by R.G. Price and Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about the evidence for and against a historical Jesus, but primarily the reasons why both R.G. Price and Robert M. Price think that Jesus probably did not exist. And we're going to look into both of their different takes on that conclusion. All right, so R.G. Price and Robert Price, thank you both for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I'll have the links to purchase their respective books in the description below and in the pinned comment. Without further ado, my first question to the both of you is, what kind of problems do you both see when attempting to reconstruct the historical Jesus, or to try to know anything about the historical Jesus in general?
I'll let Dr. Price go first.
Just beat me to deferring to you. Yeah. For one thing, there's no real biographical evidence about this character. He does not connect with secular history in the way, for instance, that Caesar Augustus does. There's somebody about whom some of the same type legends were told, including the slaughter of the innocents kind of thing, and the miraculous conception, and calling his story a gospel, etc. But there's no way that there was no Octavian, no Caesar Augustus, right? He's just too connected to world history in all sorts of ways. But the same cannot be said about Jesus. Now, somebody might say, Price, you are insane, which may well be true, but not because of this. It seems to me that though the figure of the gospel Jesus, the Jesus, the figure of Christian theology, obviously swept the world and has determined much of history, that's not quite the same issue as to whether, when you examine that picture of Jesus in the Gospels, whether it has any rootage in history. And it seems, of course, at first that it does, because after all, isn't Jesus connected with Pontius Pilate? We know he was a historical figure. We have two different ancient writers talking about him, contemporaries, Philo of Alexandria and Pontius Pilate. The problem is, though, that from everything both of them say about Pilate, the gospel portrayal of Pilate doesn't seem at all to fit. According to Philo and Josephus, Pilate was basically a Jew hater who outraged the people he was governing every chance he got. This person, had he actually had charge of the Jesus of the Gospels, would have squashed him like a bug, whereas he is pictured as somebody in Jesus' corner who says, whoa, what do I have to do to get you guys to give me permission not to execute Jesus? Why is he at the mercy of just a nameless mob of roustabouts beneath his balcony? That's just not Pilate. He's willing to let go an anti-Roman insurrectionist killer and to execute a man he repeatedly exonerates. Look, what's the problem with this guy? What has he done? But he nonetheless lets himself get bullied into sentencing Jesus to flogging and crucifixion. Similarly, Herod the Great. I mean, surely Jesus is connected with Herod the Great, right? Well, there's a big problem there because, of course, Herod the Great has only to do with the nativity story and the slaughter of the innocents. And, of course, Herod was a bloodthirsty paranoid. That's true. That rings true. But not only does Josephus, who catalogs the abuses of Herod the Great, say nothing about this. The whole story seems to be based on Josephus's version of the Moses nativity with Pharaoh's slaughter of the innocents, and even more so than the basic Exodus story. What are the chances of that? It just seems to me that it's much more likely it's a literary borrowing. Caiaphas, the high priest, well, we know he existed. They even found his tomb. Yeah, but the only thing we hear about him is that on Passover Eve, he skips the Seder just to go to a kangaroo court hearing for Jesus. This is like the Pope saying, look, somebody else is going to have to take the Easter service here because I got something to do. No, it's just a villain to hiss at, and so on and so forth. It all seems artificial, just like the occasional mentions of other historic Roman era potentates in fictional novels. It's just like it was today. People do docudramas that aren't very docu, and so that vanishes, and that's just a part of the problem. The other side of that is that there is no shortage of points in common between the gospel Jesus and the mythic hero archetype. All of the boxes are checked. There's an annunciation from a heavenly power. There's a miraculous conception. There's an attempt to kill the infant. There's a child prodigy story where he turns out to be more wise than his elders. There is a commissioning story where the heavenly voice summons him to his task, just as in the case of Abraham and Zoroaster and others. Then there are miracles of various sorts attributed to him, including ones that specifically contrast his ability to heal anybody whom he doesn't even personally know, contrasting, I say, with sad cases of people seeking help from ordinary AMA certified physicians and getting bupkis for their efforts. But Jesus, bingo, immediately. Jesus is said to heal zillions of people in mobs wherever he goes. Now, I know there are people that claim to be healers today, but people with a success record like that, I don't think so. And then, of course, he's betrayed by the very crowds that loved him and prosecuted, unjustly condemned. And he dies on a hilltop, oddly enough, a common feature of these stories. And then there's confusion as to where he's buried. And when they find it, he's not there. He's been taken to heaven. From which he then briefly reappears to give a pep talk to his followers. If you fill in the blanks, it's you could be talking about Jesus, Oedipus, Apollonius of Tyana, the Buddha, etc., etc., etc. So you've got to ask yourself, though we weren't there, we don't have a time machine, we can't actually verify or falsify, what seems more probable? That such a figure of such a description, to whom such feats are attributed, was one lone historical instance of this, or that he's one of the apples in the barrel labeled mythic heroes, and the historian can only deal with provisional conclusions, probabilistic theories held open to disconfirmation or revision. And based on that, if you're taking a historical approach, the burden really is on the shoulders of the people that would say there was a historical gospel-like Jesus. And, I forgot one of my major points here. Virtually every story of Jesus in the Gospels, plus several in the book of Acts about the apostles, can plausibly be argued to represent a rewritten version of various Old Testament stories of Joshua, David, Moses, Elijah, Elisha. Oh yeah, feeds multitudes with just a little bit of food, etc., etc., etc. Again, what's more likely, that somebody actually did these impossible feats, or that somebody just rewrote a very popular scriptural story that everybody knew? Well, obviously, it's the latter. And that's what I think happened. Sure, don't know it, don't have a time machine, but it seems to me highly the most probable position that there was no historical Jesus.
RG Price.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Dr. Price said, um, eh, obviously there's all these things about, well, what's, likely and probable and what seems reasonable. There's always, now I think the common sort of theme among these arguments is really dealing with, was the story of Jesus, no matter how unrealistic the story is, was it inspired by the life and ministry of some person, even if it all got exaggerated and blown out of proportion, and even if the Gospels don't retain a single word that he originally said? Isn't the reason that these stories were written to record the life and teachings of some person? And that's where I think actually really digging in to the writings and understanding how they were written and how they developed um, goes directly at that issue. And I was one of the, someone who assumed that as well. I think for most people, the idea is certainly something had to have inspired someone to write this account. And if it, what would it be other than some person that would have done this? Well, what I talk about in Deciphering the Gospels and the book that I'm currently working on, is that when you go back and you examine, especially starting with the Gospel of Mark, and you examine it in detail, what you find is that virtually every single scene, as Dr. Price just talked about, is based on the Jewish scriptures. And so the first question is, well, if somebody was inspired to write this based on the life and teachings of a person, why aren't they concerned with the life and teachings of a person? Why are they content to write a story where every scene is based on the Jewish scriptures? But furthermore, what I talk about in my book is the fact that when you look at all those Jewish scriptures that these stories are based on, what you find is a very consistent theme. And that very consistent theme has to do with the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. And of course, what we just talked about, how many of the stories are based on Elijah and Elisha, things like this. That is, a big part of the theme of the Gospel of Mark. And when you look at the story of Kings, of course, starts with, Solomon and David and all this kind of stuff. And then it gets to the point where Elijah comes into the picture. And this is when there's the corruption of the Israelite kings, and all the kings are, doing horrible things, and they're going after Elijah. And all of this is what's setting the stage for the downfall of the Israelite kingdoms. So the ministry of Elijah and Elisha is essentially the prelude to the Assyrian and Babylonian invasions. So it's what sets the stage for the destruction of Israel by the Assyrians and Babylonians. And the end of Kings, the end of the book of 2 Kings, ends with the siege of Jerusalem, surrounded by the Babylonians, and then they come in, they breach the walls, and they destroy the temple. And when you read the end of 2 Kings, and you read Josephus's account of the Roman siege of Jerusalem, they are almost parallels. I mean, they're very similar to one another, not because of any sort of literary borrowing, but because ancient sieges were ancient sieges. They involved armies surrounding a town, waiting until it, sort of starved out, and then coming in and setting it on fire and destroying everything. The same thing happened with the Babylonians and with the Romans. And I think that anybody after that siege of Jerusalem could read what happened in 2 Kings and say, wow, this looks like history's repeating itself. It looks like the Jews have done the exact same thing that their ancestors did, and they wrote a story about it. And when they wrote that story, they used a whole ton of Jewish scriptures. This is why every scene in the Gospel of Mark is basically based on Jewish scriptures that allude to either the story of Elijah and Elisha, who are setting the stage for the destruction of Israel, or scriptures specifically about things foretelling the destruction of Israel, things like quotes from Jeremiah and things like this, where Jeremiah is talking about the speaking the words of the Lord is upset with you guys, and he's going to send his armies to come destroy Jerusalem and destroy his own home and all that kind of things. And these things are alluded to over and over again in the story. So when we ask the question, what would have inspired somebody to write this story if it wasn't a real person? The answer is the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred after the Great Revolt in 70 CE during the First Jewish and Roman War. That's the inspiration for the story. And I think that's a key part of understanding, of having an explanation of how this could have developed without some real person being there. And the thing about it is if there was a real person, then how come all these scenes are based on Jewish scriptures? And then how come all the other subsequent writers, whatever you want to call them, Matthew, Luke, everybody else, is just copying from this one story where all the scenes are invented based on Jewish scriptures? If those people really knew something, if those people really had oral traditions to go on, where somebody described, oh, here's the things that Jesus did or that or the other, and they knew some real account of the real person, they wouldn't just be copying from another story that's obviously containing scenes that are just made up based on Elijah and Elisha and things like that. They would know some other real story that was different than that, and they wouldn't just copy it. So that is, to me, a huge part of it. And then to me, the ultimate thing is the fact that once you recognize the fact that all these scriptures go back to the theme of the destruction of the temple, because we have all of these scriptures in the Jewish scriptures about the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, and that is 85% of the scriptures that are alluded to in the Gospel of Mark are dealing with those scriptures about the destruction of the first temple. That means the story couldn't have even been conceived until after the First Jewish-Roman War. There's no way the story is based on accounts of something that somebody did in 29 or 30 CE, because the story is all conceptually rooted in the destruction of the temple. Like, the scenes are fundamentally based on scriptures that are about the destruction of the temple. They can't be something that was a retelling of something that actually happened, 50 years prior to that, because 50 years prior to that, there would have been no concept for this idea of the temple being destroyed. So why would you be inventing a scene of, the idea that there was some real Jesus and he actually did something that was based on something, the miracles of Elijah and Elisha? I mean, give me a break. That's not realistic. Not only is it not realistic, it's not realistic that people in the 20s or 30s or 40s CE would have invented those scenes, because the only reason those scenes have any relevance is in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem. So the whole thing has to have been invented after the destruction of Jerusalem.
There's a similar sort of a thing going on in Fourth Ezra, also known as Second Esdras, where you have Ezra mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And I think it's Uriel, the angel of Revelation, who comes and says, well, it's pretty bad, but at least you don't have to worry. God loves you, because unlike these people who were punished, you didn't deserve it. And then Ezra keeps arguing with him, sort of survivor guilt. I'm no better than them. Why did I survive? Like he's complaining. Well, but because of the obvious evidence of the Roman era dating, scholars say, well, yeah, this is really about the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, but it's discussed in terms of as if it were the Babylonian destruction. And it's not quite the same thing, but in a way it is, because you're trying to understand recent events by analogy with events of the past that happened the same way. And here, though, I realize it's sort of flipped over, that the gospel writers are trying to make sense of the destruction under the Romans by saying, well, we know what led to the Babylonian destruction. It must have been something on the same order. And so it was. Just we've changed the names to protect the innocent.
Yeah, and there's an interesting aspect of that, which is, has had its unfortunate sort of repercussions throughout history, which is that, with the original Jewish scriptures, I mean, not the Christian ones, but the original Jewish scriptures, the fact that the Jews who wrote those scriptures conceived of their God as being an all-powerful and loving God, what it meant whenever they wrote their scriptures, the fact that their ancestor civilization had been destroyed was a fact of history. It had to be reconciled in some way. And if their God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, and their ancestor civilization was destroyed, it has to mean that their ancestors were to blame. And so the blame for the destruction of Israel and the first temple went on to the Israelite people themselves. And so you have Jewish people basically casting their own ancestors as villains in their story of their own history. And what ends up happening is that whole cycle repeats again with the Gospels, is the fact that Jerusalem was sacked and the Romans were victorious must mean by definition that the Jews did something wrong, that they were bad, and that the Romans now were the ones in God's good graces. So basically the transfer, it's sort of a story about the transfer of God's blessings going from the Jews to the Romans, which is evidenced by the fact that Jerusalem was destroyed. That must be a punishment from God. That's the only way it could happen, right? If you believe that your God is powerful and loving, if you're being punished, it must be your own fault. So that's sort of an unfortunate I think effect that has happened is these ideas both in the past and that have continued to reverberate throughout history of this idea of blame for the things that happen. So at any rate,
once I wrote an article, I think for Free Inquiry, is the Bible anti-Semitic? And I pointed out this thing that the blame is, Israel looks bad again and again and again. The book of Judges, the Kings, like you mentioned. Why would Jewish writers make their fellow Jews and their ancestors into apostates who will visit sacred prostitutes and worship idols at the drop of a turban? What is this vilification? Well, what's the alternative? It's to say that God is asleep at the switch. You can't blame God, or the whole thing is over. You're left in despair. If this means God is a traitor to his own covenant and there's no justice in the world, oh no, that's the worst. We would rather believe that, may God be true and every man a liar. It says somewhere that it's better to bear the blame ourselves, to scapegoat ourselves, so we don't have to say, I guess it was just a big joke. There's no covenant with God. In fact, Richard Rubinstein, in his book After Auschwitz, draws this point out, saying, tell me, Jewish theologians, what Jews did to merit the Holocaust. What did they do that so infuriated God that in his justice, he sent him to the ovens, care of Adolf? He says that's absurd. And if the covenant theology means this, and if God's covenant faithfulness can accommodate something like this, what does it even mean? So forget it. It means nothing. And he says, in fact, the idea that we're the chosen people has only ever got us into trouble. Well, I'm not saying that's the conclusion people ought to reach, but he saw the same thing, that you're trying so hard to get God off the hook that you're just making yourself a whipping boy. And it's a very bizarre and ironic way to look at God and your religion.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, in part, what ended up happening after the first Jewish-Roman War, well, and even whatever you call it, the last Jewish-Roman War, the one with Hadrian, whether you call it the second or third, what happened after both of those is, what has occurred again many times is non-Jews looked to the Jewish scriptures and said, "Oh, look, your own scriptures even say you're a problem. So, of course, your own God hates you. See, your own scripture said so." So, I guess the people that originally wrote those didn't realize they were setting their descendants up for so many problems. But yeah, it was certainly, I think, related with the rise of Christianity, basically built on that theme of blaming Jews, in this case, for not recognizing their own Savior as bringing the destruction. And when you read the church fathers, whether it's Lactantius or Eusebius or even Irenaeus and others, they all pick up on this theme, and they all understand the symbolism in the Gospels. They just think it's real. They all draw the conclusion of, you see what happened. They didn't understand the prophecies for their own Messiah, and therefore, as a result, they killed their Messiah, and as a result, God punished them by sending the Romans to destroy them. Well, I mean, that is sort of symbolically what the story is about, but it's all made up.
Yeah, just like the parable of the wicked tenants. That God's completely faithful to the deal he had with those he put in charge of his vineyard, Israel, but they were unfaithful to him. And so, what's the point of the story? This is why God is taking Israel, the vineyard, from the customary owners of it, the Jewish people, and giving it to a nation. I think Matthew is the one who puts it that way, who will be faithful to what they owe to God for their stewardship. And so, again, that's it must be so. Otherwise, God is screwing us. Well, that can't be. We don't want to face a prospect of utter nihilism. Better to say God moves in mysterious ways, or we must have sinned. Maybe we can do better. In fact, if you'll excuse a parable from Saturday Night Live years ago, I love this one, where it's Christmas morning and the family is gathered around the tree, but there are no presents, and the kids are wailing and weeping. But the parents have no explanation except that they actually believe in Santa. They didn't buy any presents because they still believed Santa would bring them all. And so they're explaining to the kids, well, kids, I thought for sure this year we were good enough to deserve presents from Santa, but I guess we weren't. We're just going to have to try harder next year. Well, you keep that up, you're never getting any presents. And it's the same thing. You're blaming yourself because you're well, because you do believe in Santa, but that's the same kind of idea. Oh, yeah, we have a faithful covenant God. Boy, it sure doesn't look like it from the results. Well, maybe it wasn't God's fault, it was ours. And so what's the worst thing you could think of doing that might bring this down on your head? Well, like you just said, killing the predicted savior. I mean, oh boy, you're slitting your wrists there.
Right. Yeah, and to get back also to a little bit to Jacob's question, I think one of the other things that I think so many, just average people, and even people that have studied this to some degree, don't really appreciate fully is the extent to which our understanding of Christianity and the origins of Jesus was so heavily shaped by one extremely narrow group of Christians.
Mm,
And, I mean, over the past 20 years, especially, I mean, obviously a lot of this has been in the works for 200 years or so.
mm,
Um, but especially over the past 20 years, it's just been a real growth and understanding of just how diverse Christian belief was
mm,
in the second century. And
mm,
then what came out of that was a very narrow view. And that view was held specifically by a group of Christians who held a very certain theological belief about Jesus being a human being that was born on earth. And that's one of the things that in my new book that I go into a lot is showing that I think the traditional view of the New Testament has been that the New Testament, for whatever flaws it may have, is a record of the earliest writings that were produced about Jesus, and they've come down to us essentially as they originally were written, and they haven't been altered and modified and all this stuff by the church fathers, quote unquote, let's say.
mm,
I held that view for a long time. I no longer think that at all. The New Testament is a product of proto-orthodox heavy editing and modification.
mm,
And I think all of these gospels, well, especially Luke, John, and Mark, Luke, John, and Mark were revised by proto-orthodox, either a proto-orthodox individual or small group of people. And Matthew was basically just completely rewritten by a proto-orthodox. I mean, Matthew is the flagship Orthodox gospel,
mm,
um, and all these other things. And the Pauline letters were all revised. So what we have is not some original copy of the earliest writings about Jesus. We have a collection of writings that was specifically designed to convince people that Jesus was a real person. That was
mhm,
the goal of the Orthodox Christians. That's why they added the birth story. I mean, the original writings had no birth stories. I
mm,
don't think that Marcion's gospel was the first gospel or is the original gospel, but I think it does. It is more similar to the earliest gospel than probably any of the Orthodox gospels. Well, to some degree, the Gospel of Mark is also as well, but neither of those had birth stories. That doesn't necessarily mean the first gospel specifically said Jesus floated down from heaven, but clearly Orthodox revisers felt the need to add this story about Jesus being
mm,
born in order to prove that Jesus was the son of the the creator God, because he's the God that created matter. And so if Jesus is born into the material world, that means he's the son of the creator of the world. And so this was all part of their theology of saying we have to prove our point that Jesus is the son of the creator God. He's not the son of some unknown spiritual God that didn't create the world. And therefore we have to make Jesus appear on, be born on earth in the flesh. He has
mhm,
to be fully human. All these things are second century theological constructs that have been foisted onto this whole thing. And it was all in order, in the service of proving that Jesus comes from the creator, right? So there's all these ways that we can define that Jesus
mhm,
came from the creator. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Marcion was right, or that various Gnostics were right, and that how their religion started. I don't even know that they got it right. I don't know that any Christians, whether heretical or not heretical, got any of the story right. That may be a little bit too difficult to tell. I don't know that I've been able to get back and say this is definitively the first original version of it. I'm still unsure as to whether the original version of it was something like Marcion talked about, where Jesus was in the service of a separate God, or if the original story had Jesus being related to the Jewish creator God. But regardless of how it originally started, it's certainly the case that Orthodox Christians were set to prove Marcion and other quote unquote Gnostic type Christians wrong and prove that Jesus came from the creator God.
Yeah, I think that going right along with what you've said so well is what what's his name? I can never quite. Oh boy, one of the great mythicists, Arthur Drews or
Oh yeah,
Draws. I don't know how
Arthur
you
yeah, right,
pronounce it.
yeah,
He said that why did they historicize Jesus? If they did, what would have been the reason for that? And he said, well, it was the contest, as you just said, of the warring versions of Christianity, which were avowedly based on revelations, like in the dialogue between Simon Magus and Peter in the Pseudo Clementines, where Peter says to Simon, where do you come off claiming to be an apostle of Jesus? You never even met him. We lived with him and traveled with him. We got it from the horse's mouth. Who knows what led you to believe the crazy things you do? Well, that's a way of saying, or like think of I think the Apocryphon of James, where the apostles are all sitting around having visions of Jesus telling them this and that, which they write down. Well, apparently that's what everybody was doing. They had a word of wisdom, a word of knowledge. Jesus, the ascended one, says this. Well, you could just say anything you wanted. Who could verify it? And or if they did, it was by their own intuitive subjectivity. And so Drews said that somebody finally decided to pull rank and say, we don't just play can you top this and say, well, anything you can reveal, I can reveal better. No, we actually have it from the horse's mouth, which is what Irenaeus does explicitly say against the Gnostics. So we can point to a picture and say, our founder. So if he was the Son of God, we know what he said, and he didn't say the crazy stuff you're making up. You have the copyright, huh? And that is a pretty good explanation, it seems to me. It was a way of trying to find a place to stand to claim that you had the objectivity of it. You had the inside track, and everybody else is just winging it.
yeah, and that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the degree to which modern quote unquote biblical scholars, and even people like Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, he's obviously with some of his things with whatever it is, for the writing about forgery and fraud and forgery and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
He recognizes so many of this stuff, but what we have to really recognize is our concept of Christianity comes fundamentally from the church fathers. Everything, the whole concept of how it all started is the story told by the church fathers. It's the story told by, Irenaeus and Eusebius and all these guys. But even though we say, okay, well, that's the story of how it all began, and we're going to believe that story, every single point along the way of claims that the church fathers have made are all disproven one after another, but people still end up saying, well, okay, they were wrong about this, they were wrong about that, they were wrong about that, but we still basically believe their story. I mean, that's what's so crazy, because even, modern biblical scholarship, almost everybody now recognizes the Gospels were not actually written by somebody named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew wasn't really written by an actual disciple. John wasn't really written by an actual disciple. But the thing to really understand is the reason that those proto-Orthodox Christians, that their version of Christianity won and became the model that Christianity was adopted around the world, that everybody knows, um, is precisely because of those claims. Those are the claims that led people like governors and emperors to say, well, everybody's making claims, but you say you have the real documents signed by the real original disciples. And if these documents are the real ones because they've got names attached to them from the original writers, and these others are anonymous works that we don't know where they came from, well, I guess you must be right, and we'll adopt your version of the story because you've got the receipts. Well, the receipts are all forged, so that's the only reason that this version of it won out, is because of the false claims that were made. Now, I don't necessarily think that these church fathers were necessarily intentionally making false claims. I think many of them likely believed what they were saying. Some of them may have actually, been in on it. I don't know, but I mean, certainly I would give them all the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, they received these documents. They believed that these were legitimately written by those people, and that's why they put stock in it. Um, but regardless of whether they were knowingly wrong about who wrote the Gospels or not, the fact of the matter is they were completely wrong. And the reason that they won the sort of ancient argument about which version is right is because of many of these falsehoods.
Yeah, that's right. And even the ascription to apostolic names, it's all circular because there's a Gospel of Peter, but they show it to the bishop, and he says, "Well, this looks docetic to me, so I guess Peter didn't write it." Or the
Right.
Gospel of Thomas. Gee, this stuff about encretism and pre-existence of souls, that can't be true. So Thomas, a good apostle, couldn't have written it. So even though they claim to base it on the authority of known apostles, these other ascriptions have just as much justification, unless the real criterion is, does it agree with our theology? And if it does, okay. Now, where they're in trouble is if the ascription is not to an apostle, even if it is orthodox, like the Shepherd of Hermas or the Epistle of Barnabas, and so on. But there, you can say, well, if you're not Batman, it's not bad to be Robin. Were they associates of apostles? And but why would you think Barnabas, the actual Barnabas, if there was one, I'm not so sure. I sort of think he was um, um, a fictive character for reasons I won't trail off into. But they some must have agreed with what he said, some didn't. So it never quite got in the canon, but did continue to get published in the same codex. I think it's in the Sinaiticus, for instance. And so the apostolic authorship was really simply window dressing for the theology that people wanted authorized.
Yeah, well, the Barnabas is an interesting one too, because I think that the Epistle of Barnabas is a commentary on the four gospel on the now canonical four gospels.
Hmm.
It can be argued either way to say, well, was this written without knowledge of the Gospels, and it just happens to reflect them in the things in the Gospels, or but I think it was a commentary on the 4 now canonical Gospels. But what, as you say, what gets it into trouble is that it clearly is talking about many of the things that we find in the Gospels, but it doesn't have fully what we would call today an orthodox interpretation of those things. So it offers non-orthodox interpretations of what are essentially the Orthodox Gospels, which is one of the areas that got it into trouble. But it was not Gnostic either. It wasn't like on the side of Marcion or Valentinius or any of those. I think it's just a very early proto-Orthodox writing that even itself fell out of favor, as time went on, where it wasn't orthodox enough, and it didn't continue to have enough of a.
An apostle couldn't have written that,
Right.
so he didn't.
Oh, so James Valiant. James Valiant says here, does Hebrew scripture really exonerate the Babylonians so much as blame the Hebrews, as Christians seem to let the Romans off the hook and imply God has taken their side?
I think that you have to think of what it says in Isaiah, where it says that God has whistled up the Assyrians and sicked them on Israel. But don't worry, they're going to get theirs in the long run. It has the idea of God, like in the Joseph story, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So they had this hunger to conquer everybody. Well, that comes in handy for God. It's wicked, and he'll punish them for it. But in the meantime, he might as well use their mischief as a way of browbeating Israel, because they deserve a spanking right now. So I think it's that kind of using one against the other, rather than exonerating the Babylonians, which they don't seem to do. They do with the Persians, though, because I think their delegate, Ezra, imposed a kind of Judaized Zoroastrianism. And so Cyrus can even be called the Messiah. And they overthrew the no good Babylonians. But I don't think the Babylonians come off too well, smelling very sweetly in the Bible themselves.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And so when you think about it as well, if the story of the Gospels is sort of a retelling of the story of the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, the way I read it and look at it is, yes, the Babylonians are not exonerated, and the Jewish scriptures don't say that God's favor went over to the Babylonians necessarily. But what I think the way that the Christians read it, or in the way that it was written, is, well, that was the first chance, but this is the Jews' second strike, and now God's giving up on them. That's how I read the message of the original gospel writer, sort of the earliest version of what would be the Gospel of Mark, is I guess I would say their theme that they were projecting in the story was the gods gave the Jews a chance once, and then he had to punish them with the Babylonians, and then he was going to give them a chance again, and then now they've screwed up a second time, so now God's favor is going over to the Romans. There's definitely the end of the gospel is God's favor is going over to the Romans. I mean, that's I think it.
Yeah, that's right. In all of this, God inviting blame, and Israel saying, "Oh, no, it's our fault. It's not you, it's me." The idea that we don't want God to get a bad reputation, even if it's deserved. Remember when Moses is on the mountain with God, and God says, "You hear what's going on down there? They're having an orgy. Stand back, Moses. I'm going to hit him with a comet or two, and that'll be the end of him." And Moses says, no, wait just a second. If you do that, what's going to happen to your reputation? people will hear about this and say, hey, did you hear about the Hebrew God? He went to the trouble to lead his people out of Egypt only to smash them flat at Sinai. What a jokester. And he says, now, for your name's sake, please give them a break. And God calms down and says, yeah, I guess you're right. It's amazing. Mm.
So I want to ask this question. That is, so you would both agree then that the way the New Testament is framing the Romans is they're being, in some sense, exonerated in a way the Babylonians never were in the Old Testament.
Mm.
Well, I would say that that is true of the Gospel of Mark. I don't think it's universal across all of the writings in the New Testament, though. Some of them sort of hedge against, and yeah, so you got different writers and giving a little bit different messages in some instances.
Well, Luke has the notion that when the Roman hammer falls, Jewish people will be exiled, which is itself dubious historically. That's really what happened later, but that's okay because that initiates the times of the Gentiles, and then at the end of that, then Jews will be in favor again. That kind of reminds me of Romans 9 through 11, that Jews have rejected Jesus, and but don't worry, don't just write them off like some of the Thessalonians apparently did. Well, so much for them. You say, hey, hold on a second. Yeah, they're in bad light with God now, but God is pretty clever. He let them fall away temporarily to give the Gentiles a crack at the gospel. And once the whole number of them comes in, which sort of implies he's got a guest list or a predestination list, then you'll see Jews take a second look and say, son of a gun, these Christians have gotten these stupid pagans to snap out of it and worship the biblical God. Maybe this Jesus thing isn't so bad after all. At least that's what I kind of think he's saying in Romans. So it sort of depends on what the Gentiles do, and God may have it all planned out like the next moves in a chess game. But I see we have another great Jewish Roman historian among us here.
For some reason, Jacob sent me the StreamYard link, and for some reason I clicked on it.
I'm glad.
I was just enjoying the conversation so much that, it seems to me that, for example, Paul at Romans 13 clearly calls the Romans God's agents on earth. And, to not pay your taxes is not just a practical matter, but a matter of conscience and morality, for example. And we seem with the passion narrative itself to have a remarkable kind of exoneration of the Romans that is far more elaborate than anything we see with the Babylonians or even Cyrus the Great, who fascinatingly is called Messiah in Hebrew, older Hebrew texts. But the passion narrative is going out of its way, not just to blame the Jews, but in all four Gospels to have Pilate declare Jesus to be innocent. And then, of course, we have a whole bunch of other things. It's true. I think I agree with the other Price here. I think both Prices are right. There is a definite difference in the Gospels, and there are takes on this various thing. But, for example, in all three of the Synoptics, we have the vineyard parable that you mentioned earlier. In Matthew, for example, we have the centurion whose faith is greater. You know what I mean? We clearly have, let's put it this way, they go out of their way to be positive towards the Romans in a way that we don't see that kind of elaborate detail either in the Passion narrative, which is obviously a fictional parable, and the bone structure of all four Gospels. Passion narrative clearly has to be seen as a fictional parable, both blaming the Jews. I mean, we've got The Sanhedrin is heavies. We've got Judas betraying him. We've got the crowd demanding his death 3 times. But we also, in all 4 Gospels, have Pilate saying, this guy's innocent, in various ways and in various degrees. And to the way I see it is sort of like Bart Ehrman sees it. As the Gospels progress, it appears to be getting more and more and more anti-Semitic and, in effect, more implicitly pro-Roman. But if you combine stuff like the praise for the centurion, the vineyard parable, and then Romans 13, where the Roman government is straight up God's agent on earth, it appears to be much more akin, let's put it this way, not identical to, obviously, but much more akin to Josephus, who specifically says God's gone over to the Roman side. And guess what? My boss Vespasian, he is the true Messiah. And so there we have evidence, and indeed from Tacitus and Suetonius, who say that Vespasian and Titus were Jewish messiahs. We have from pagan sources evidence that the Romans themselves were using Jewish religion in their own propaganda, which would be remarkable and something I don't see in either the Babylonian or even the Persians, who kicked those bad, naughty Nebuchadnezzar his tail. But thank you, Persians, for liberating us. It seems Josephus seems to be going much farther, and the New Testament seems to be going much farther than any of that in saying, well, no, God's actually gone over to the Romans. And you've got Josephus saying, that the Romans are actually utilizing that in their own propaganda. Yes, Vespasian and Titus were the real messiahs, says Suetonius and Tacitus. And further, another curious element to all of this is that in the Jesus Apocalypse, we have, within the lifetime of my listeners here, kids, we're going to have the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the Son of Man coming in glory and power. That's the fulfillment of Daniel's Son of Man prophecy. And curiously, Josephus, just even hiring a Jewish propagandist, as Vespasian did, is a very interesting fact in itself. But we've got Josephus saying that at the fall of Jerusalem, their armies seen fighting in the clouds. So Josephus himself is kind of saying, yeah, the whole Jesus prophecy has been fulfilled. Whoever the Son of Man is, whether that's Vespasian or Titus or even some other kind of entity, the Son of Man prophecy of Daniel has been fulfilled, just as Jesus said it would in the Synoptics.
Yeah, and I don't, having not gotten into all that enough myself, I will say I won't necessarily take an opinion on that specific part of it. But there's one thing I do want to say that I agree with you with, is that when Josephus wrote his, Antiquity of the Jews, that actually I think did have a big impact, and it played a role in adoption of Christianity, because I think Romans started seeing even more profoundly the idea that, hey, wait a minute, maybe these Jewish scriptures really are prophetic, and they really did have the right religion. And so it worked into this idea of, wait, the Jewish scriptures really were inspired, and there really is this real history that comes up, and all these things that happened really are the fulfillment of Jewish scriptures. And Josephus's work, I think, its publication in the Roman world helped open Romans into that understanding of the Gospels of, hey, wait a minute, this is really fulfilling all these ancient prophecies and stuff. And one of the other things that actually the book that I first started working on after my Deciphering the Gospels, which I've now set aside to finish another book, it gets into a lot of the Roman religion with the Sibylline texts and all this kind of stuff. And, Romans were extremely heavy believers in prophecies, and their most sacred texts were these, what are obviously also forged prophetic writings. And it was so deeply integrated into their culture. I mean, these texts were housed in the temple of Jupiter. They were consulted by the Roman Senate whenever they would be making, big decisions. They would have these priests come in and read from these texts, which they were probably also writing at the same time. But nevertheless, the whole Roman government was centered around this worship of these prophetic writings, supposedly prophetic writings. And so when they started reading the Gospels and seeing how they correlated to the Jewish scriptures, and they were reading Josephus's work about all this history, ancient history of the Jewish people, it did have a big influence there.
I have to agree, and I think you have philosophical reasons why the Greco-Roman world was even tending in a more monotheistic direction. I think Stoics in general were starting to head, certainly Platonists, Middle Platonists, and Neoplatonists in the 2nd century were already heading for philosophical reasons in the direction of monotheism, making the religion more tempting to people in the Roman world, Jewish religion. And obviously the New Testament is the version of the Jewish religion that was most amenable to Roman civilization, given Paul's critique of Torah and so forth, the worship of a sort of a man god. Previously messiahs were just messiahs. They were men, they were dudes. They could do miraculous things like Moses or Elijah or something. Love the earlier discussion of how Hebrew stories are recycled by, in the Gospels about Jesus. There's no doubt about that in my mind. I owe the world a second book, by the way, because my thought on this is further developed and updated. But I absolutely see what you're saying. They believed in prophecy. They believed in astrology. We know that Tiberius and Vespasian, 2 Roman emperors, had astrologers on staff to tell them what the portents in the sky were indicating. And it was sort of state-protected knowledge. Sometimes they'd crack down on other people using astrologers. But prophecy, it's the Sibylline prophecies, obviously were super important to the Romans. You're absolutely right there. That's for sure.
I'd say, James, an interesting thing about that is when you look at the record of public prophecy in Rome after the rise of Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, it goes into decline, but it doesn't go into decline because the Romans stopped believing in prophecy. It went into decline because it became basically a state secret. It became the Octavian or Augustus started outlawing other use of prophecy because it was too powerful. It had to be under state control. And so what happened is that the broad use of prophecy declined, but only because it was brought under state control and was more heavily regulated during that time.
Precisely. It was now akin to a state secret because, people who have the, true insight on what's to happen, it's a politically potent thing. And when you've moved from, a more, let's put it this way, open republic system to the empire, now we've got someone on top who's got a political interest in controlling that information. And it would have an impact on popular attitudes. There's no question about that in my mind. And I think you got that just exactly right. I just find it absolutely fascinating that we have clear evidence, though, that, after the First Jewish War, it appears that the Roman government themselves are affirmatively using Jewish messianic religion in their own propaganda.
I wonder how to figure into this what Bruce Molina's book about Revelation being thoroughly drenched in ancient astrology. That is talk about revelations. That book is astounding. He went through the huge body of ancient astrological texts that are still extant and says, we can see from this what virtually all of the imagery in Revelation stands for. The trumpets and so forth. That was code for comets and one thing after another. He settles the issue of who are the 24 elders around the throne in heaven. They're the decans, the stars that govern the particular hours of the day, and it's amazing. And I wonder how that fits into this, because the book of Revelation is completely about the end times as astrology predicts. I never thought there would be such a thing. And just reading the book, it's totally convincing.
Wow. Yeah. And Revelation, the pointing to Nero, or maybe Domitian is the new Nero, depending on how you want to read Revelation. That's not atypical for Romans to rip on their own rulers either.
Mm.
It's fascinating in that way. I mean, you can't read Suetonius and Tacitus without getting a very negative view of both Nero and Domitian, and that's coming from Roman senators writing in the early 2nd century. But so very much like you were earlier discussing how the Jews would blame themselves for things that might go wrong, the Romans were not above blaming their rulers and themselves when things go, because their state religion was, look, we've conquered the world. The gods really must be on our side. That ipso facto, see how successful we are. And contrary-wise, when punishments fell upon them, they would almost always interpret them in terms of some moral crisis brought about by the divine.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Nero is interesting because obviously later stories present Nero as a villain, and Nero's the executioner of, Paul and all this stuff. But I think that it's people have thought that because Acts of the Apostles ends with Paul in Rome and he doesn't die, that it's supposed to mean that that was originally interpreted as that means that it was written before he died and all this kind of stuff. But it has a positive ending with Paul in Rome, whereas most of the later stories have this negative ending where it's a bad thing. But I think in the earliest version of that story and in the earliest version of the Christian narratives in general, in the ending with Paul in Rome during the reign of Nero was a positive thing. The ending of Acts of the Apostles has Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, being saved from the Jews, and he's rescued by the Gentiles and whisked away to Rome, where he can then preach the gospel. And the fact that Paul ends up in Rome during the reign of Nero is, I don't think, a coincidence at all. That is when the Great Revolt began. And so what I've been working on and sort of reconstructed is that there was at one time, we have now Luke and Acts of the Apostles. I think the original Gospel of Mark also had a version of Acts on the end of it, and it went from Jesus all the way to Paul, ending up in Rome during the time of Nero. And it was one big epic that was a fictional allegory about, the Jews repeating the cycle of history and all that kind of stuff. And it ends, on the eve of the Great Revolt there in Rome. But the thing about it is that that ending is still essentially preserved in Acts of the Apostles, because that was the original story. The original story was Paul the apostle to the Gentiles being saved by the Romans, not being killed by the Romans. And then later on, this whole thing about the Romans being bad and killing Paul and Peter and all these others, that's a later development.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, in Acts, apparently the Romans sent an entire cohort to protect him when he was transporting him from Jerusalem, right? I mean, that's a whole cohort of the Roman army that's being used to protect Paul.
And as I've shown recently, all of that was copied from Josephus's description of a Saul, including when Lucius Carinus toward the end of the 2nd century AD, he took the story of Paul's martyrdom and the Acts of Paul, because he created the Acts of Paul, and he was copying it from Josephus, because Josephus is talking about Saul and his brother Costobarus appearing before Emperor Nero in AD 66, because they were going to try to lay the blame of the Jewish war upon Governor Florus.
In this connection, I have to recommend a book that gets almost no attention, but Rosemary Sheldon and Thijs Veskulen's Operation Messiah, where they go through the book of Acts in some detail about, and they come to the straight up conclusion that Paul was, from the description, Paul's a Roman agent. I mean, he's constantly getting his rear end pulled out of the fire. When an angry Jewish mob is chasing him down, the typical way the story is told is that the Romans or some local Roman official or a whole cohort of the Roman army is pulling Paul's bacon out of the Jewish fire, as it were.
Yeah, I think the issue is, from my vantage point, they're not taking the evidence of conflation very. They're not aware of the conflation of identities with Paul, and also this doesn't account for the conflict between Acts and canonical Paul, which is all over the map, as we all know.
Yeah,
so I think the theory is essentially true, but we don't. I don't think Acts is necessary to see it. We can look at the canonical letters themselves. We can look at the Clementine literature separately from the mess that is Acts, which ain't facts, by the way. I just have to put that out.
Acts ain't Acts. That should be a t-shirt. Acts ain't facts.
Well, Acts is a mess because when you look at Sergius Paulus, for instance, he's living in the. I think I remember they found there was evidence that was found that Sergius Paulus was actually in the 2nd century in the AD 120s.
Well,
there is no evidence of a consul Sergius Paulus.
Yeah, we're told
in Cyprus in the AD 50s.
That's exactly it, Jake.
But there is one, but he's in the wrong location in the wrong decade.
Well,
in Rome, he's in Rome in the AD 70s.
Right. So we have Sergi Pauli, if you will, for at least a century, but a proconsular governor of Cyprus named Sergius Paulus, we only can verify in the early 2nd century, in the 120s.
Check this out. Go ahead, Valiant. I'm going to go find it while you say
No. I was just pointing out, I think, something that y'all might find interesting. That's all.
Yeah. Well, there's certain parts about the book that I'm currently working on that I'm not going to talk about until I publish it. But one of the things that I think, because I've mentioned this to Dr. Price before, is that, and I'm far more confident about it now than I was previously, but this idea that the Gospel of Mark's ending has been lost or whatever is something that's been around for a long time. Is there a lost ending? Does it end the way it was supposed to? Is the short ending the right ending? All this kind of stuff. And I'm absolutely convinced that the Gospel of Mark, the ending that we have has quote unquote been lost. It was supposed to go on, but the real original ending of the Gospel of Mark was that Jesus revealed himself to Paul. That's what happens at the end. Is all the disciples abandoned Jesus. The stuff about Jesus saying, "I'll go and I'll meet you in Galilee." That's all later gloss added by proto-Orthodox writers. The original ending was all the disciples abandoned Jesus, and Peter's abandonment of Jesus is resuscitated by all the other gospel writers, right? It's resuscitated by Matthew and Luke, who try to, patch it up and make it look like it wasn't so bad, and then they reconcile at the end. But it really was meant to be a break and to show that those disciples were all failures. And then as a result, Jesus reveals himself to Paul. And then what you find when you take the first person portions of Acts and the beginning of Paul's part in Acts right after the crucifixion of Stephen, that sort of matches right up to, you can take basically Acts chapter 8 and just smash it right up against the ending of the original ending of the Gospel of Mark, 16:9, and it reads right on through. So it's, to me, the original story was, and this is one of the things about the church fathers, is that they're so far off. The original story was against the disciples, and it was against Peter. It was meant to show that they were false apostles. And when you look in the Pauline letters, you see that there's all these comments about false apostles, and there's one that talks about um, even minions of Satan disguising themselves as false brothers and stuff like that. And then of course in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus calls Peter Satan. And I think this is related directly to that. Those Pauline letters where it says that minions of Satan disguise themselves as angels of light and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's the original story was definitely very different from the current, and was meant to discredit Peter, James, and John in order to establish that Paul was the one and only true, real apostle, and the one that Jesus really reveals himself to at the end. Is
That's
how I think this story originally went.
And this is what I was trying to find earlier. I did a show with Professor John Kloppenborg a couple of years ago about this, 3 years ago actually, the Erastus inscription, because it was redated. Originally, this was put in the AD 50s to fit the magical consensus dating of Paul's letters. But it turns out this thing doesn't fit the magical dating of the epistles. This is actually in the AD 130s in Emperor Hadrian's era, making this person about, which I think this means this person is Erastus the shipper under Hadrian's reign in the AD 130s. But we can't have that. That must mean it's a different Erastus. It can't be Erastus in Paul's magical letters to the Romans and Romans 16. The perfect, almighty, unquestionable letter to the Romans has to fit the magical AD 50s. But it turns out the guy's living in the 2nd century. So if he's living in the 2nd century, I could conceptually believe that he's active at the end of the 1st century. Maybe let's say he was born in the AD 70s or something like that, or the early AD 80s. I would be more comfortable with 70s, or a little earlier. But that doesn't really work with him being a full-grown man in the AD 50s or earlier, because if Erastus is still alive in the AD 130s, then he has to be young or middle-aged at least, no later than that, in the AD 90s, when these epistles first actually show up with certainty to make sense of this inscription. And I did a couple of shows recently about a lot of issues similar to this. And I did shows with Derek recently about this, that there are serious and temporal issues with Paul's letters.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, Jacob, to add on to what you're saying there, what the conclusion I've drawn is, and again, I'm not going to go into all the details here until I get a lot of stuff published, but the conclusion I've drawn is that, as one of your other presentations talked about not that long ago, either Paul is a completely fictional character, or Paul is being recast back in time, in a way similar to the way that the Jesus story is, in order to situate everything prior to the Great Revolt. So Paul is either a 2nd century person being cast back before the First Jewish-Roman War, or he's just a fictional character altogether. But it's definitely, I think, not the case that there was some real Paul running around just in the 1st century prior to the Great Revolt, and then happens to end up in Rome in the reign of Nero.
To explain my position a little bit more clearly, because I'm writing this for Bob's journal, all of what I'm talking about will be in the article for Bob. When you look at the church fathers, there's a problem that has not been noticed to my knowledge at all. And that is, we have 3 different chronologies that contradict each other. Like, let's start with Clement, which I think the genuine Clementine literature is earlier than the canonical Pauline epistles. Because if you look at First Clement, Clement only mentions, he only cites one letter by Paul, just one time. Now, you see other stuff in Clement where you have stuff that parallel canonical Paul, but not quite. I'll give an example of this. You know that little line in Clement where he says that Paul made it to the furthest west of the empire? So Paul gets to Hispania. I said Spain. A couple of picky people will say, "Oh my goodness, it's Hispania." I'm like, yes, whatever. He made it to the furthest west of the empire. Now, in canonical Paul never makes it to Spain. He says he's planning to go to Hispania in Romans 15. Never talks about having made it there. Clement also talks about Paul being imprisoned 7 times, which is nowhere to be found in the New Testament. The 7 imprisonments of Paul. So the thing is, there are certain descriptions that Clement is describing that don't match canonical Paul, that don't match Acts either. Not to mention that when you look at Clement, I don't think he's aware of Paul's vision either. And even if he did, it ain't quite the same vision we see in the New Testament at all. He knows nothing about Paul being going up to the third heaven, or 14 years ago, or this, or three years with Barnabas. He has no idea that Barnabas met with Paul. In fact, the Clementine Recognitions has a Matthias Barnabas. But that's a story I'll save for another time. But
and you see the Recognitions as being authored by the same guy who wrote First Clement. You see, it as pseudo at all. Is that right?
Well, it was modified by Tyrannus Rufinus at 401 AD or thereabouts. So Tyrannus Rufinus in the preface admits to putting stuff in, removing stuff, adding things here and there. But Origen, the church father in the 3rd century, says there are 10 books by Clement, 10 books called the Travels of Clement. So if Origen knows about it in the 3rd century, that to me means a great deal of the Clementine literature is earlier. Now, as Bob pointed out recently, there are scholars that believe that a lot of it goes back to some Ebionite work. But to me, what's the difference with saying that the Ebionite work was actually the genuine piece of it by Clement? What's the difference? So because Origen already knows about that earlier work, that's what he's talking about, the 10 Travels of Clement, before it was modified by Tyrannus Rufinus. That's just the same thing to me. It's just larger than one would expect. But anyway, let me get to the main point. Clement thinks, as Oscar Coleman pointed out in 1930, I believe, that other Christians killed Paul. He says that Paul was killed by those who were jealous, rivals, people of envy. But when you go to the Acts of Paul, he's killed by Emperor Nero, which was copied by Saul's death, or implied death, in Josephus's text. Then you have Jerome, writing in the 4th century in the 390s AD, who thinks that Saul of Giscala was alive after the Jewish war. He said that Saul and his family fled Giscala to Tarsus when the whole land was being laid waste. And he's getting this, but Jerome tells us he gets this information from Epaphroditus, or Epaphras, same guy. And then after AD 70, Saul basically becomes Paul. So we got 3 chronologies. So Clement's got an early death for Paul. Clement appears to think Paul died in AD 39 or around that. Then you have the Acts of Paul with an AD 66 death for the guy. And then you have Saul of Giscala, who's outliving Emperor Nero after AD 70 and is active in the AD 90s. So when does he die? The AD 30s, the AD 60s, or the AD 90s? Let me make another point. What about 2 Thessalonians? this is one of my favorites right here. People say, "Oh, Paul is saying that there are people that are writing letters in his name that are fake." No, that's not what it kind of says that, but not quite. It says in our name, not Paul's name. Our name in 2 Thessalonians. What the hell does that mean? Oh, the letters are multi-authored. Read the beginning of 2 Thessalonians. It was written by 3 guys. 1 Thessalonians was written by 3 guys. People just gloss over it all the time. These aren't merely scribes. These are co-authors on the level of Paul himself. These are co-authors. And you have, that's why there's it's a co-authored anthology. That's why there's people in Paul's letters contradicting each other on eschatology, how they view Jesus, all of it. It's a mess, not because Paul himself, the letter writer, is saying, "Oh, we're cool with lying, Romans 3, lying, spreading falsehood for the glory of God. That's all fine and good." And I can't remember if it's in 1st or 2nd Corinthians. One of those letters, Paul says he's all things to all men. I tell these people this and this people that and whatever. So lying is condoned. On top of that, the letters are multi-authored. I'm
not lying.
Yes. In eight of the letters, 8 out of, I want people to think about this, even Romans. The only difference is Romans Tertius or Tertius, however you want to pronounce his name, mentions himself in Romans 16, not in the beginning. But 8 of the letters are co-authored, multi-authored. There's only 5 Pauline epistles in the Bible that are not co-authored. Galatians, Ephesians, 1 through Timothy, and Titus. That's it. Those 5 letters are the only ones that are claiming to be single-authored. So that means a vast majority of the Pauline letters are multi-authored. But people are just not thinking about that. And I think that talking about endless hypothetical interpolations and developments in Paul's letters, I have a problem with that because I'm like, well, the letters are already kind of telling you what's going on. They are a multi-authored mess happening around the same moment. We don't have to hypothesize unprovable stages. Okay, so 1 Thessalonians is 2:13 to 16 is an interpolation because there's no way Paul could write that before AD 70. Well, you can't find a manuscript where it's missing. How about the whole damn thing is after AD 70? What about 1 Corinthians? It makes an argument about. Then I'll shut up after I say this. How about 1 Corinthians where it talks about the temples are inside you? Don't make buildings to God, or they'll be subject to the flames. So that's the problem here. So
yeah.
Well, I'll finish by saying Clement only mentions one letter by the original First Paul. That is it. He doesn't know anything about the canonical text. That's why I have a problem moving Clement material into the 2nd century, given how ridiculously ignorant he actually is about this, and that what little he says about Paul in several places contradicts what the canonical text says.
Well, you know, the fascinating thing about Jerome is that he implies that Paul was a young man when Judea was laid waste and the people were dispersed.
Yes.
Took him, and he still was yet to study under Gamaliel. So what? Wait, huh? He's a young man, and if Jerome is onto something, then he's telling us, and he is citing a named source. So he's got a source that says Paul is a young man at the time of the destruction of the temple, and that sure the heck can't be anyone who fled from Aretas. You know, as Paul gives us in his little mini autobiography of his sufferings in 2 Corinthians. I mean, fleeing from Aretas can only be the late 30s. And
right, and that's the point I was making recently. That's a copy from the First Paul.
Yeah, I think the traditional understanding of the timeline of all this is so out of whack and unreliable, and it's unfortunately the vast majority of traditional scholarship is so rooted on the traditional understanding of all this. There's so much resistance to try to really let the material speak for itself and outside of tradition, because everybody who's an official biblical scholar learns the traditions and learns to interpret all of these within the traditions. That's which I'm sure Dr. Price did as well, but he was smart enough. But that's what they teach you, right?
Yeah.
That's the framework in which all of this is to be understood, right?
Mm.
As Dr. Bob constantly reminds us, in the Dutch radical tradition, these letters are just a mess. I mean, they're all over the place on a whole bunch of different things. And the chronologies, like Jacob points out, are also kind of all over the map on this. We've got characters who were associated in the 2nd century. We've got a young man in the 70s. We got a guy who fled from Aretas. And then the traditional view in Acts is that he's arguing his case before Governor Felix, and he's got Agrippa II and his sister there. So
And notice that the book of Acts never talks about Paul's letters, because I think the author of Acts is writing at the point where Acts has access to, in my opinion, canonical Paul and the pre-Clementine Paul that I talked about earlier, the first Paul, the original Paul the Apostle. So Acts is trying to conflate the dude that Josephus is talking about, the dude Clement's talking about, and the guy in canonical Paul. The problem is, by doing such a thing, you will also end up creating other contradictions that cannot be harmonized. It's literally impossible. So the author of Acts interestingly mentions the letter of James, which is, I think it's obviously our letter of James. I know some people try to say it's not. I think that's ridiculous. But so it's okay with mentioning the epistle of James briefly, but it will never mention any of the letters of Paul. Any of them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But I don't, and that's one, I don't necessarily know what, if that's meaningful or not meaningful. And if that was an intended, I mean, the problem with some of these things is, these ancient writers were very good at guiding their readers into having their readers draw conclusions that they wanted to. In fact, in one of the books that I was writing about Roman prophecy, what I talk about is literary magic tricks, and that's essentially what these ancient writers were. Is they knew how to perform literary magic tricks and sleight of hand to guide readers into reaching all these different conclusions. And this was not just a Christian thing. This is how ancient writing was done, and there was all kinds of fraud and forgery with religious writing, non-religious writing, all these kind of things, and they were very good at being able to get sort of manipulate readers into believing certain things. And so it's hard to know if this writer was intentionally trying to give the reader the impression that they hadn't used Paul's letters and as a guide to their narrative, and that's why they intentionally left it out, or if that was just unintentional, or who knows.
Well, the thing is, by the way, in case anybody's curious, I think that the Gamaliel that Jerome's talking about is Gamaliel II. So I think that's the guy that Salabiscala was taught by, not the pre-war more famous Gamaliel I.
And Hedron dude.
Yeah. The letter of James is mentioned in Acts 15. So that's where it is. That's why I paused for a second earlier, because I was looking for that.
And those
I want to think about. Oh, just so I can finish. What I want people to think about is look at Acts. It thinks that Paul fled from Jews from Damascus in the AD 60s. And it's the same kind of flight from Damascus we see in 2 Corinthians, but they're 30 years apart. So my point is, Acts is not just creating theological contradictions with the letter writer Paul and the Clementine Paul, but it's going out of its way to even contradict little details in Paul's life. What's the deal? The biographical contradictions are so serious, the list is so long, that I think it's not simply just trying to change Paul's theological views. It's remaking his life. It's like a reboot of Superman or something, or a reboot of X-Men or Captain America. Like, let's
No,
change
it's
the
more like
detail.
the Star Trek reboots where they have different
Or
topics.
that too.
Well,
Star
yeah,
Trek reboots.
Jacob, I've been wondering the same thing, and actually, I posed this question on the Early Christian Writings forum: is if Acts was intended to be a replacement for the Pauline letters, and so my question was the person who wrote the canonical version of Acts of the Apostles, did they not intend for that story to be in a collection alongside the particular collection of Pauline letters that it resides with? Because were they writing this as something to replace those letters? And so, in other words, if this was written sort of as an anti-Marcionite, if Luke and Acts was a sort of anti-Marcionite type of collection of works, where it was, taking either Marcionite or broader other quote unquote heretical views and presenting an alternative version of that, is Acts the replacement to Marcion's Apostolicon, which then later on by other people accidentally got lumped back in with the same letters that it was meant to replace?
Well, to put it mildly, it's been singularly impossible to line up the letters story, if you can piece it together, about Paul and the story in Acts. It's just really, really hard to say.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to briefly respond. I think that I am convinced that Marcion's cutting down canonical Paul with a sword. As Tertullian, I think Tertullian is right that Marcion is writing with a sword, not with a pen. Because you notice that all the co-author, Timothy, Silas, and Sophanes and Tertius lose their role as co-authors in Marcion's version of the text. And by getting rid of the co-authors, you're getting rid of the chaos in canonical Paul. In Marcion's Paul, it's more orderly. Paul is not a contradictory mess as he is in canonical Paul. And to me, it's more likely the more chaotic, larger text is earlier under these circumstances, whereas the shorter, abridged, orderly text is later to try to clean up the mess. Marcion probably was aware that the pre-war Paul couldn't possibly have written all of this, so he was trying to create a new collection and harmonize canonical Paul with the pre-war Paul. It's not perfect, and you can see examples of this when you look at, say, Badoon's reconstruction of the text. 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 doesn't look like a post-war text in Marcion's version, because he still has Jews killing Jesus and blaming the Jews for killing Jesus, but it removes the wrath of God coming upon Judea. That's not in Marcion's version. Yet, ironically, in Marcion's version of 1 Corinthians, that little business about temples being subject to the flames and human beings being the replacement for the temple spiritually is still there. So he removes quite a bit of the post-temple ideas in canonical Paul, but misses a few spots. And that, to me, is a strong indicator that he was attempting to clean up the mess of contradictions in canonical Paul. And also, Marcion was more a fan of Paul. He didn't really care about the co-authors. He wanted the co-authors out of there. And he wanted to focus more on Paul's authority, what he thought Paul really was.
Right. Yeah.
That's
I think,
really interesting. Yeah.
I think what I would I would think that what happened with the Pauline letters was likely similar to what happened with the Gospel of Luke, and I think many scholars now would agree that the most likely way that we can reconcile Marcion's Evangelion with the Gospel of Luke is that the canonical Gospel of Luke is not derived from the Evangelion, and the Evangelion is not derived from the canonical Gospel of Luke. They both have a common proto-gospel, and Marcion edited down the earlier version, proto-Luke, and the canonical Luke is built on proto-Luke and adds to it. And I would think that the same could be the case of the Pauline letters, where there was an earlier collection of Pauline letters. Marcion edited that down. The canonical letters are built off of that same collection and expand upon them. And it would have been sort of a similar process for how the letter collections developed and how the Gospels developed.
Well,
Or how
I do think Marcion's gospel knew the canonical gospels. I think it is cutting down Luke, but I also think it knows an earlier Luke where it's all of Luke with just the first 2 chapters missing. That's because pseudo Tertullian seems to know about it, and to be honest, that's the only reason I believe it exists, because I am that skeptical about hypothetical documents. Unless there's an ancient text attesting to it, I won't believe it exists. Or unless we have a manuscript of it, I will not believe it exists. So one of those criteria has to be met, or I just won't believe it. The pseudo Tertullian talks about Curdon being in possession of a Luke, but the first 2 chapters missing. But it's not exactly the same as Marcion's gospel, nor canonical Luke. And that's what I think those 2 texts are deriving their information from. But in this case, I just think Marcion just knows Curdon's gospel, and or also known as pseudo, the Gnostic, same guy. So that's what I'm talking about. But in Greek, it's Curdon. But Luke, so Marcion just knows both of those texts, is what I would say, my opinion.
It seems to me you can save yourself a plane ticket to Boston for the SPL conference by just coming to group meetings like this. This is where you're going to hear cutting edge theorizing and readings of the New Testament and its background. It's amazing.
It's always a seminar with you, Dr. Bob.
I'm listening most of the time to this fascinating stuff.
Before we close, I want to kind of briefly go back to what we were talking about earlier about the development of the critical thoughts on Judaism that we see in the Gospels. So when we look at Mark, we're already seeing Romans being excused for the death of Jesus. But when you get to Matthew, it gets progressively worse. When you see in Matthew, it says that the blood will be, that the Jews are saying the blood will be on them and their descendants and forever. And when you get to Luke, now the devil, Satan, is possessing Judas. And then in John, it says the Jews are the sons of the devil in John 8:44. Which I know that some try to tap dance around what John said. I'm like, no, it's literally what it sounds like. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse in each gospel. And it sounds like that it's trying to make it Satan seem like he's on their team. They're working together to persecute Jesus and the early Christians, and that's what it looks like to me. That's what it looks like the text is claiming to be the case.
Yeah. So you can kind of read Mark as being anti-disciple, and it's exonerating the Romans and blaming the Jews, but it does seem to get progressively more anti-Semitic as the material develops. There's no doubt about that. But it's really fascinating, the discussion about Luke, and we've got, it seems to me, attacked on New Beginning to Luke, So it is a question of whether there is this proto Luke that's being paired. I mean, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. You really make a good point, sir. It is though there's a proto Luke that's being added to make our canonical Luke, and proto Luke kind of pared down to make Marcion's evangelion. That would be a really good way of understanding, making sense of the material.
If you look at Matthias Klinghart's reconstruction, you can see that there's a couple of additions to Marcion's gospel, which kind of contradicts the idea that Marcion is just writing with a sword. For the most part, he is. But there's a couple of instances that I know of where Marcion's actually adding. I'll give an example. There's a line in Marcion's gospel that says, "You will wish that you were never born." Like, well, that's not in canonical Luke, but it's in Mark and Matthew. And then there's another instance where it says that it talks about not saving a drowning animal on Sabbath. Whereas in canonical Luke, it talks about saving a drowning child and an animal on Sabbath. Later versions of canonical Luke that are not in the Bible change the text and remove the mention of the child in that same verse. And it's generally agreed by scholars that the one where the child is not mentioned is a later version of Luke. And it does look that way to me because that does come from later manuscripts. And it's kind of interesting that Marcion's gospel agrees with later variants of Luke, or what appears to be later variants of Luke. But I would say about the part where Marcion's gospel mentions not that you will regret having been born is even more interesting, because it means that we got evidence of embellishment in Marcion's gospel that is missing from canonical Luke. And one last thing I'll say about this is that it looks like Curdon's Luke is basically all of Luke, with the first two chapters missing, which even that would make the text still larger than Marcion's gospel. And so Marcion is just simply he's either cutting that text down or he's cutting down both Luke and Curdon's gospel at the same time, which is the latter is what I suspect. And I mentioned recently that if you look at the followers of Marcion, there is a man called Lucan, the Marcionite, a follower of Marcion. And I think Lucan is the guy that wrote canonical Luke Acts.
Well, if we're open,
Bob, you also mentioned that there is another Marcionite called Apelles, or at least he was a former Marcionite. And I do agree with you, it's the same Apelles in Romans. Well, the thing about that is that you can't have canonical Paul any earlier than the AD 90s. So this Apelles is active in the AD 130s and 140s, just as Erastus is active in that same time period.
Yes. Wow.
It all fits.
Oh, man.
If we're open to the idea of different flavors of Marcionites or that school, then all that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we know there were various competing Marcionite schools of thought, like was Jesus the son of the demiurge, possibly, as some thought, sort of like the Silver Surfer in the Fantastic Four. He's the agent of Galactus, but then turns against him. And which Jack Kirby must have known. He's got the Kabbalah and everything in those comics. Sheesh.
Yeah. Well, and that does tie a little bit into the thing with John about Satan too, because there's definitely elements of John that seem like it's actually a Gnostic gospel that's been revised by.
Yes, sir.
But and so one of the Gnostic views is that basically Satan and Jesus are sort of comparable figures, and sort of you've got the creator God, and Satan is the one who does his bidding on earth. And then you've got the superior God, and Jesus is the one who does his bidding on earth. And so
Hmm.
Jesus and Satan are battling each other for their fathers. And so Satan's father is the Jewish creator, and the unknown God is Jesus's father. And that's one of the things that potentially the potential reading of the Gospel of John. But at any rate, to bring it back to the original sort of question in the beginning of this whole thing, when it comes to the whole issue of Jesus existing, I think the big key for me is there is not a single description anywhere by any person ever who talks about Jesus as a human being that is not describing the Jesus from the gospel stories. Every single person that talks about Jesus positively or negatively as a person is talking about the character from the gospels. And the character from the gospels is a fictional character. And one of the things that's interesting about the way that Christians have sort of dealt with the gospels and all of this stuff about Jesus for so long, from the very beginning with the church fathers, is talking about all these similarities and how all these stories are so similar, and they verify each other, and they all confirm that these are the true attributes of Jesus and all this stuff. But the reality is, and many of the sort of people that want to have tried to sort of poke holes in the Christian story have talked about all the differences between the stories and say, well, these stories are contradictory. But the reality is that what really matters is the similarities. And the fact of the matter is, all the descriptions of Jesus are so similar to one another that it's essentially copies. It's all copies of one story. There's variants here and there where people have made theological differences, and they've said something that contradicts that for some philosophical reason. And so this is how you get these contradictions that work into things. But everybody's telling essentially the same story. There is nobody that describes any realistic version of Jesus. Every version of Jesus is the miracle Jesus that does all these various things. Everybody from Justin Martyr on says, I believe that Jesus is the Savior and the Son of God because of what I read about him in these stories. There's nobody that says, well, I was a follower of Jesus and he didn't really do all those things, but I still worshiped him even though he didn't do that stuff. There's nobody that says anything like that. Everybody is only talking about one Jesus, and it's the Jesus that they read about in one of the dozens of versions of gospels. Some version of a gospel, they read something about some miracle working guy, and that's the Jesus they talked about. Even guys like Serto that you're talking about, or various other, who's the one that, what's Justin Martyr's against?
Trifo.
Yeah, right. Even the Greeks that wrote against him basically were working from the Gospels. They start from the Gospel story and then say, well, you see, he's not really a good guy, and then they reinterpret the Gospels in some way that shows that he wasn't really as good of a person as you might think because of a different way to interpret the story. But there's nowhere anywhere is there any realistic description of Jesus. I mean, even stuff like the passage from Josephus, the Testimonium, even that still gives us a miracle Jesus that if it was ever in there, it was something that was derived from the gospel stories. So there's just no reasonable description that can be pointed to that says here's something that's actually independent. And that was the whole part of the thing of what the church father said is we've got 4 independent witnesses that come together to confirm that these things were true. But what modern scholarship shows is they're not independent. They're all just copies. They're all just copies and derivations. It's just copying one thing and changing it, copying another thing and changing it. So it all comes back to the similarities are so great. It's everything stems from one story. And it's not just that, right? It's all of the evidence indicates that everything comes from a single source. You've got the fact that you've got these nomina sacra. Every single Christian writing, whether it's heretical or not, everything that we found, whether it's in the Nag Hammadi library or anything, they all have these nomina sacra. Well, that means that there's some unusual particular thing that every single Christian was using. That doesn't happen if you've got independent sources, right? That means it all came from one source. The fact that they were all published in codices and nobody was writing any of this stuff on scrolls, they're all writing them in the codex. So everybody's publishing these things all in the exact same way. Again, it all points to, all the evidence points to, there was one singular point of origin for this whole thing, and then it spread and mushroomed, and yes, people came to believe it, but there was never some broad, diverse array of disparate, independent sources that confirmed any of this. It's one story that exploded. It went viral. It is truly the ancient version of going viral.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Please, Bob, go.
I'm fixated on comic books and stuff like that, but it does provide a bunch of apt analogies. Think of the quest of the historical Superman. Suppose somebody believed that there really was a Superman, and he goes, he's an apologist for Superman comics, and is trying to say, yes, this is a real figure. You just can't believe anybody could do these things. But of course, none of us could, but we're not from the planet Krypton, where things are different. And so what are your sources for Superman? Well, there's Action Comics, there's Adventure Comics, there's the Justice League, there's movies based on these comics, and so forth. But there's no other, there's no actual newspaper accounts or anything. Or, well, no, but look at all the wealth of stuff you do have. And then you get the person to say, well, all right, I'll admit it looks like it's been fictionalized. There have been imaginative embellishments. Okay, maybe he couldn't really leap tall buildings in a single bound. Maybe he couldn't be faster than a speeding bullet and so forth. That may be puffery. But if you get rid of all the legends, there's still the historical core, and here it is. The historical Superman was Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper. What? That's Superman? That is the...
But the thing is, I think that one of the points that's being made here is there's not even the mild-mannered Clark Kent with respect to Jesus.
Yeah.
Our literature seems to
Where
be
do we hear about him?
Exactly.
In
that sense, Superman's story is a little more plausible. We've got at least a human face to a mild man. Oh, see, so there was this reporter, and then they just made up all these fantastic stories about him. So where's the Clark Kent? You see, if there was a Clark Kent hiding in the Gospels, I think we'd have less of a problem. Let's put it that way.
And if there was just Clark Kent, he may have been one heck of a reporter, but where would anybody got the idea to have him flying through the air and bouncing bullets off his chest?
He was a hell of a reporter.
Well, yeah, I am always amazed.
Right?
I am amazed by the extent that some people, including theologians, will go to basically minimize Jesus in order to make him believable, but still end up claiming that, okay, well, we've gotten to a point where the real Jesus was basically just a Jewish beggar on the street, but the fact that the Gospels were written about him means he's still the greatest man in the world and he's still worth worshiping. Like, well, but wait a minute. You're saying that he was really just a Jewish beggar on the street and somehow all these stories were made up. And why? It doesn't make any sense. They're willing to diminish him all the way down to nothing just to prove he's real. Or not prove that he's real, but just to be able to claim the possibility that there's a really undetectable human being behind it all.
Well, if I were
like,
to make
was Merlin the magician real?
Yeah.
Some people say that, well, there was a Welsh or Cymric poet named Myrddin. He could have been the basis for it. Well, even if that's true, Merlin didn't exist. You're just really
You see,
grasping at straws.
even if we say, I mean, a lot of people were crucified in the first century
Mm.
AD. I mean, especially in the 60s and 70s around the first Jewish
Mm.
war, right? And so we can only imagine that there were a bunch of people who were crucified, a bunch of Jewish people who were crucified, even some rebel leaders who may have claimed to be messiahs who were crucified in the first century AD. So the idea of a guy crucified by the Romans in the first century AD and whose followers thought of him as a messiah or a potential king of the Jews is absolutely plausible in itself. And in fact, there may be multiple of these Merwins, like you say. There could be multiple of these Merlins. And the same, I think, in a sense, holds
No
for
doubt
Paul.
there were.
And the same, in the sense, holds for Paul. You know, we've identified multiple sources, you know, whether it's Josephus or you, Dr. Bob Simon Magus or something, where there might be a historical figure who's being layered into our heavily mythologized Paul. And similarly, I think we have to be open to the idea, because if I were to make my my best argument for a historical Jesus, I would say something like, as I just said when I first arrived at the conversation here, look, all the Gospels are trying to blame the Jews and exonerate the Romans to some extent. So why would they, if you're inventing it from scratch, why don't you just have them stoned by the Sanhedrin, like Stephen was, or James was, and Josephus? You'd have just had them stoned and have them nice, clean, let's blame the Jews, and we're out of here. Why would we have to stand on our head to explain away a distinctly Roman form of execution, and one that was going on commonly in the first century, and we're locating him in a very specific time too, Pilate. But that doesn't give us much to go on. The fact that there's a guy named, let's even say there's a guy, Jesus, who's crucified by Pilate. You know, there may well have been a dude named Jesus who was crucified in the first century by Governor Pilate. Is that the guy in the Gospels? Nothing close. The guy in the Gospels is a bunch of recycled stories from Hebrew Scripture. He's a miracle man who performs all these amazing, and his death and resurrection is this amazing thing that we need to really pay attention to. No, it's the mythologized Jesus of the Gospels and all of early Christian literature that point to this mythologized being. So if you're going to ask me, what can I know about a historical Jesus? Well, there may have been a dude named Jesus who was crucified in the first century under Pilate. That does not mean we're talking about the Jesus of Paul or the Jesus of the Gospels. That's a different and heavily mythologized figure altogether. And it does seem, as you say, to be coming from a single source. That is to say, an original story of this guy who's, let's put it this way, whose followers, if we're going to believe anything, say, in Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians, he appeared to his early followers, James, Cephas, 500, a nice round number, 500 of unnamed witnesses, and I'll put those in quotes, and then as one untimely born, me, Paul. Those visions, those visions are a supernatural, miraculous thing in themselves. So what does that tell me? It tells me that they were being informed about Jesus through their own religious experiences. They'd read Hebrew text, or they'd be influenced by the religion around them, and they would read all that into this guy that they were having visions of. It's the visions that give us the Jesus that we're talking about here, even if there was some dude named Jesus who was crucified under Pilate.
Well, undoubtedly there were people named Jesus crucified under Pilate. I mean, that's
Right.
like, is there a guy named John crucified that has been sentenced to death in the United States? I mean, absolutely. Yeah, is that the inspiration for the story? And clearly, I think the answer is no, because when you look at the story, you see that it is so contextualized around um, the destruction of the temple and the first Jewish and Roman War. That's the inspiration for the story. And when it comes to Paul's letters, they're such a mess. I mean, it's difficult to use them as evidence of anything. But certainly, the Pauline letters, even in the most generous reading, are by no means interested in any Jesus person. I mean, even if you try to say, well, this thing might mean that Paul knew that Jesus was a person because he said brother. Well, I mean, let's ignore the fact that there's probably 1,000 interpolations into these things, and they've been edited and revised by all kinds of people, and that it could be misread, and it could actually mean brother, like a Christian brother, and all these kind of other possible things. But Paul is by no means gives us any biographical information. He's not concerned about a person. He's talking about a deity. So the Pauline letters about a Jesus deity, and the human Jesus doesn't come into existence until after the First Jewish-Roman War, in the invention of a story in which there's an allegory about this Jesus deity being like the prophets of old, whose Elijah and Elisha, whose ministry foreshadowed the destruction of Israel.
Let me just take this super chat, but I do have to get going.
Yep, me too.
Adam S, thank you for your super chat. Was half of Jesus' disciples were teenagers? What is that about?
I suspect
I'm gonna guess this has something to do with Ehrman Hillman.
Yep, that's what I think.
Thank you for the super chat, but that is way off topic. I mean, and well, I guess it's not off topic. I'll just say I disagree, and I don't feel like addressing this any further.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
But
there's really only 3 disciples that are talked about. The rest are just kind of names on a list, anyhow.
Yeah.
Names on a list. Yeah. I mean, okay, we got fishermen. Okay. I mean, but teenagers, I don't see it. But I am looking so forward to your work, sir, on Mark and the continuity into the story of Acts, and on Roman prophecy. That sounds
me too.
Work. Super fascinating stuff there.
Wow.
Well, all right.
Very fascinating and educative.
RG Price, James Valiant, and Robert Price, thank you all for joining me today. The links to their respective books will be in the description below and the pinned comment, and I'll see everyone later. Thanks.
Thanks, all.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.